The elite class was far from unified. Its members came from different backgrounds and often had competing interests, each trying to gain influence over the king, who held ultimate authority in all aspects of governance. At the same time, the king relied on their support to manage the affairs of the state, while also guarding against potential rivals who might align with dissatisfied factions at court. These internal power struggles are rarely detailed in official records, but traces of them appear throughout the historical record. There were many instances where royal succession did not follow the expected pattern of a son inheriting the throne from his father. Sometimes it's unclear whether this break in tradition was due to a lack of a suitable heir or the result of a deliberate seizure of power. In Assyria, for example, after the son and grandson of Tukulti-Ninurta, the first came to power, Asurnadonapli and Asurnariri III. Another of Tukulti-Ninurta's sons, Enlil-Kudurri-Usur, assumed the throne. Soon after, a completely new dynasty emerged. These events likely occurred during a period of political instability, especially considering that Tukulti-Ninurta was assassinated by his own son, a situation that likely emboldened rival factions. However, the historical sources offer little clarity on the internal conflicts of that time. A more thoroughly documented struggle took place in the mid-14th century within the Mitanni kingdom, as discussed earlier. Two brothers and their sons fought over the throne for years, drawing in foreign powers to support their claims. The resulting conflict ultimately led to the fall of Mitanni's independence, with its territory divided between the Hittite and Assyrian empires. We know of this episode mainly because the Hittites later used their involvement to legitimize their control over the former Mitanni lands. One of the most detailed accounts of a power struggle comes directly from the victor himself. In the 13th century BCE, following the death of King Muwatalli, who had previously faced Ramesses II at the Battle of Kadisha, succession crisis unfolded in the Hittite kingdom. Muwatalli had relocated the royal court to the southern city of Tarhuntasa, to better manage the Syrian frontier, leaving his brother, the future Hattusili III, in charge of the northern regions. After Muwatalli's death, his son Urhi-Teshub ascended the throne as Mursili III, following the usual line of succession. However, his uncle, Hattusili, felt bypassed and rebelled, eventually overthrowing the young king after 5 years. The motives behind this revolt are not fully understood. Hattusili may have acted out of personal ambition, or he may have represented discontent among members of the old northern court who had been alienated by the move to the south. In any case, he could not have succeeded alone. He needed allies. We don't know the identities of most of his supporters. Some were rival claimants to client state thrones who had been displaced by Muwatalli, such as Ben-Tashina of Amaru. Surviving records make it clear that Hattusili needed to rebuild trust and support among the court's elite. He felt the need to explain and justify his actions, which he did in a written statement often referred to somewhat inaccurately as his apology. In it, he claimed that the goddess Ishtar had encouraged him and accused Urhi-Teshub of using sorcery, suggesting that these circumstances forced him to act. The very fact that Hattusili authored such a document suggests that he could not assume unquestioned loyalty from the ruling elite, and had to actively persuade them of his legitimacy. Plots against the king occurred in other kingdoms as well, though the details surrounding them are often unclear. It's not surprising that different elite factions sought to advance their own interests at the expense of others. Their loyalties might have been shaped by regional concerns, such as opposition to relocating the royal quarter by professional rivalries, such as conflicts between priests and administrators. In some cases, competition emerged within the royal family itself, with the sons of one queen vying against those of another. Given the immense power held by the king, there was always strong incentive for influential groups to install someone on the throne who would favor their agenda. Even though not all late Bronze Age states achieved great military victories, it is striking how much wealth their elites managed to accumulate. Today, we can no longer see the full splendor of their lives from what remains of their buildings. Palaces, houses, and temples have mostly crumbled into ruins, offering only a vague impression of what once stood. The furnishings and decorative items that once filled them have long since disappeared. However, some of this wealth was carried into the afterlife, placed in tombs with the belief that it would bring comfort and luxury in the world beyond. Naturally, the wealthiest individuals had the most opulent burial places. While most ancient tombs were looted often not long after burial, there are rare examples of elite graves that remained relatively undisturbed, revealing astonishing riches. Egypt provides the most famous examples, especially the tomb of King Tutankhamun, the best-preserved royal burial of the period. Ever since its discovery in 1922, it has captivated the world's imagination. Though the tomb itself was modest in size, with only 4 chambers, it was filled to the brim with treasures crafted by expert artisans. Items made of gold, lapis lazuli, carnelian, turquoise, and other precious materials were packed tightly inside. The sheer abundance was overwhelming. The archaeologist who opened the tomb described the moment as a breathtaking sight. Unlike anything he had imagined, space looked like an entire museum's worth of objects crammed together, some familiar, many entirely unique, stacked and scattered in dazzling variety. The first things that drew the eye were the larger, more elaborate pieces. But everywhere in between, around, and on top of them were countless other artifacts, finely decorated boxes, delicately carved alabaster vessels, mysterious black shrines, one of which revealed a golden serpent inside, floral garlands, ornate beds and chairs, a golden throne inlaid with intricate designs, piles of white oval containers, staffs of all kinds, a delicate lotus-shaped cup made of translucent alabaster resting near the entrance, and a tangle of overturned chariots gleaming. With gold and inlay, behind them, partially hidden, is yet another portrait of the young king. Tutankhamun was a relatively insignificant ruler who died young and likely held limited power. If a king of such status could be buried with such astonishing wealth, one can only imagine the treasures that accompanied Egypt's great pharaohs Thutmose III, Amenhotep III, Seti Ramesses II, and others into the afterlife. Today, all that remains of their once rich tombs are the rock-cut chambers deep beneath the earth, adorned with vivid wall paintings crafted by teams of skilled artists over many years. It wasn't just kings and queens who received lavish burials. High-ranking officials from all areas of the government were also entombed with considerable luxury, though on a smaller scale than their royal masters. The tomb of Vizier Rikmire, for instance, was almost as expansive as those of the pharaohs. It must have once held a great deal of wealth. Egypt's ability to amass such vast quantities of gold and other precious materials was largely a result of its success as a powerful empire. Conquest of Syrio-Palestine granted Egypt access to the skilled artisans and craftsmanship of the region. Even more crucial, however, was its control over the gold mines to the south. Estimates suggest that the Nubian mines produced around 260 kilograms of pure gold each year. Remarkably, just 2 of the objects from Tutankhamun's tomb required nearly half that annual output. His iconic gold mask weighed over 10 kilograms, while his solid gold inner sarcophagus came in at more than 110 kilograms. Egyptian royalty and their officials weren't the only ones honored with extravagant burials. Elsewhere in the ancient world, opulent tombs were also constructed, though many have been emptied over the centuries. At Al-Antashna Parisha in Elam, for instance, a special palace complex was built, containing an underground burial area with 5 tombs. Even rulers of the small states in Mycenae and Syrio-Palestine spent heavily on their final resting places. Several tombs found in Mycenae, Tiryns, and other Greek sites were massive structures. Some still held gold, ivory, and other luxury items when unearthed, despite having been looted in ancient times. The size and craftsmanship of the so-called treasury of Atreus at Mycenae offers a glimpse of the resources invested in these monuments. Its dome, built with massive stone blocks, measures 13 meters in height and 14.5 meters across. In Syrio-Palestine, the rulers of small city-states were often buried beneath their own palaces. A significant discovery in recent years uncovered an undisturbed royal tomb beneath the palace of King Yadanda in the city of Katna. A minor ruler defeated by the Hittites around 1340 BCE Unlike Egyptian tombs, this complex remained in use for ancestor rituals over time, and it seems that the dead were buried with relatively modest riches. Still, archaeologists uncovered notable items: an ivory lion's head, a gold disc with sphinx decorations, a quiver cover, a rosette, a hand, and a pair of duck-heads all crafted in gold. Qatna's prosperity stemmed from its control of vital trade routes through Syria, and much of that wealth appears to have been concentrated in the hands of the king and his closest circle. When visiting the archaeological museums of Cairo or Athens, or watching documentaries about the cultures of the Late Bronze Age, it's hard not to be awed by the beauty and craftsmanship of the burial treasures. Yet what often goes unnoticed behind these displays of wealth is the hidden cost in human labor. Although trade and military conquest occasionally filled the treasuries of ancient states, these sources of wealth were unreliable. Trade routes could shift, especially when political power changed hands in key regions like Syria. For example, while the city of Qatna may have once controlled important routes through southern Syria as an independent kingdom, it likely lost that advantage to its rival Aleppo once it fell under Hittite control and became part of their administrative network. Military victories were also never certain, and relying on spoils of war was always a risky strategy. Expansion could only go so far before new conquests became impossible. Cutting off a once steady flow of loot, the most dependable source of wealth for any ancient state was its own farmland. Agricultural labor, carried out by local farmers, formed the foundation of the economy. But life for these farmers, whether they were palace dependents or free villagers, was far from easy. They worked in challenging natural environments, where rainfall was unpredictable and years of drought could occur in succession. In irrigated areas, low river floods were a frequent problem. Despite these difficulties, farmers were expected to grow enough food not only for themselves, but also to meet the heavy demands of urban elites. The lives of ordinary people are far more difficult to reconstruct than those of the wealthy. Their villages have received limited archaeological attention, and their simple tombs are often discovered only by chance. In Egypt, some modest graves have been found near the grand burial sites of kings, offering a stark contrast in living standards. At Saqqara, near the pyramid of King Teti from the Old Kingdom, a cemetery from the New Kingdom period has revealed burials where individuals shared wooden coffins or were laid to rest without any coffin at all. These graves contained very few goods, and even so, the people buried there were somewhat fortunate they were interred in a prominent necropolis. The vast majority of Egyptians were buried in humble, unmarked graves that leave little trace today. It's difficult to determine exactly how many people lived in cities versus those who farmed in the countryside, but there are some clues. At the city of Ugarit, for instance, scholars estimate that a rural population of around 10, only 6,000 to 8,000, with more than 5 rural workers supporting every city dweller. The agricultural base still seems insufficient, especially considering the high expectations of the urban elite. This imbalance reveals a fundamental weakness in the social structure of the time, a stark inequality that left most people with little. It's not surprising, then, that the elites chose to live in exclusive neighborhoods that functioned much like today's gated communities. The overview given here is necessarily simplified. The contrasts are presented in sharp terms, but the general picture holds true. Across all late Bronze Age societies, from the largest empires to the smallest kingdoms, a deep divide existed between two major segments of the population. The majority were farmers, struggling to make a living on land they either held communally or rented from powerful institutions. These rural workers bore the burden of supporting a much smaller class of urban dwellers, skilled specialists who served the palaces and lived in relative comfort and wealth. This privileged urban class stood at the center of the grand accomplishments remembered in historical records: military campaigns, monumental construction, long-distance trade, and elaborate religious ceremonies. They also produced the inscriptions, documents, architecture, and art that now form the core of our understanding of these ancient societies. Meanwhile, the contrast between rich and poor was clearly visible in where people lived. Cities were not only physically separate from the majority rural population, but even within urban spaces, the elites lived in secluded, protected areas, physically set apart from others. This elite separation became even more pronounced when kings chose to relocate their courts to entirely new cities built from scratch. These royal capitals were intentionally disconnected from the native populations, resembling the administrative outposts in conquered territories where only members of the ruling regime lived. In this way, the relationship between elites and their own people often mirrored the way they treated foreign populations under their control. Around 1230 BC. A Hittite king Tutankhamun IV signed a treaty with Shaushkamua, the newly installed ruler of Amaru. The two kingdoms had maintained close ties for at least a century, largely due to Amaru's strategic location. This kingdom, which stretched from the northern coast of what is now Lebanon into central Syria, sat at the crossroads of three major powers, the Mitannian, Hittite, and Egyptian spheres of influence in Syrio-Palestine. Each of these great states had, at various times, managed to assert control over Amir or U by the time of Tutankhamun IV. The Hittites held firm control over northern Syria, and the new king of Amir was required to submit to this dominance. The treaty outlined the obligations of Amaru and serves as a prime example of the diplomatic relationships that existed between major powers and their client states in the late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean. Examining this treaty gives insight into the nature of warfare and diplomacy during that period. The surviving version of the treaty was written in the Hittite language and preserved in 2 copies found in the archives of the Hittite capital, Hattusa. It's unclear which language was used in the copy sent to Amurut, may have been Hittite or Babylonian, as both had previously been used in communications between the two states. Still, the dominant role of the Hittites is unmistakable. The treaty's introduction lists only the titles of King Tutankhamun, and it makes clear that Shaushkamua was expected to accept the treaty exactly as written. Thus speaks Tabarna, Tutankhamun. Great king, king of Hatti, hero, beloved of the sun goddess of Arana, son of Hattusili, great king, king of Hatti, hero, grandson of Mursili, great king. King of Hatti, hero, descendant of Tutankhamun, great king, king of Hatti, hero, I, my majesty, have taken you, Shaushkamua, by the hand, and made you my brother-in-law, and you shall not alter the words of this treaty tablet. Amaru's position at the crossroads of 3 major powers in the eastern Mediterranean is evident from its complex history that Tutankhamun briefly recounts from a distinctly Hittite perspective, glossing over some inconvenient details in the relationship. According to his version, at first, the land of Amaru had never been conquered by Hatti through military force. When Aziru came to Suppiluliuma, Majesty's great-grandfather, the region of Amaru was still hostile and loyal to the king of the Hurrians. Aziru became loyal to Suppiluliuma, although not through conquest. Aziru, your ancestor, supported Suppiluliuma during his reign and remained loyal to Hatti. He continued to support Mursili and did nothing to offend the Hittite state. But when my uncle Muwatalli became king, the people of Amaru broke that loyalty and sent word saying, "We became your clients voluntarily. But now we renounce that allegiance." They aligned themselves with the king of Egypt, my uncle. Muwatalli then fought the Egyptians for control of Amaru. He defeated the Egyptian king in battle, conquered Amaru by force, and installed Shapili as king. When my uncle died, my father Hattusili became king. He removed Shapili and made your father Ben-Teshina, ruler of Amaru. Ben-Teshina supported my father's rule and remained loyal to Hatti. However, other historical sources reveal a more complicated reality around 1330 BC. Shaushkamua's predecessor Aziru shifted his allegiance from the Hurrian king of Mitanni to Tutankhamun's great-grandfather Suppiluliuma, the key figure behind Hittite dominance in the region. The treaty claims Aziru abandoned Mitanni, but the Amarna letters indicate that Egypt controlled Amaru at the time, and Aziru had repeatedly undermined Egyptian authority. Egypt either could not or chose not to stop him. Eventually Aziru entered into a treaty with Suppiluliuma, and he, along with his 2 successors, remained loyal to the Hittites for some time. But under King Muwatalli II, Shaushkamua's father, Ben-Tashinah, switched sides likely under pressure from Egypt, which had resumed military campaigns in northern Syria under Seti I and Ramesses II. Amaru may have changed allegiance multiple times before. Muwatalli captured Ben-Tashinah, took him to Hatti as a prisoner, and installed Shapali as the new king. The internal political conflict in Hatti, which Shaushkamua would later reference in the treaty, ultimately shaped the destinies of both Ben-Tashinah and Shapili. Shapili had been aligned with Muwatalli, but when Hattusili III, father of Tudaliya, seized the Hittite throne by overthrowing Muwatalli's son, Ben-Tashinah appears to have supported the coup. As a result, Hattusili III restored Ben-Tashinah to power in Amaru and gave him his daughter in marriage, when Ben-Tashinah's son Shaushkamua took the throne. He likewise married a daughter of Hattusili III Tudaliya, the fourth sister, and maintained Amaru's subordinate alliance with the Hittite Empire. Tudaliya renewed the treaty with him. He avoided stating outright that Ben-Tashinah had once rebelled against Hatti, instead placing the blame on unnamed members of Amaru's population, likely to avoid embarrassing his current ally. As a vassal, Shaushkamua owed personal loyalty not only to the Hittite king, but also to the royal family. Now I, His Majesty the Great King, have taken your hand, Shaushkamua, and made you my brother-in-law. I have given you my sister as a wife, and made you king of Amaru. Protect me in my reign, and later protect my sons, grandsons, and their descendants and theirs. Do not seek another ruler over yourself. This obligation is sealed with an oath. Because I have made you my brother-in-law, you must protect me and my descendants and their rule. Treaties during this era were not contracts between states, but between rulers. Loyalty was expected not to the state, but to the king, who signed the treaty on to his heirs. So far, Tudaliya's expectations were typical. But then he included an unusual clause, naming those whom he considered illegitimate heirs to the Hittite throne. In explaining why this mattered, do not give your loyalty to any of my brothers, who were born to concubines, or to any other royal descendants you consider to be bastards. Tudaliya followed this with a warning, drawing on a historical precedent: do not act like Masturi. Muwatalli appointed Masturi as king of the Seha Riverland and made him his brother-in-law by marrying him to his sister, Asanusi. But when Muwatalli died, and his son Urhi-Teshub became king, my father removed Urhi-Teshub from power. Masturi committed betrayal. Although it was Muwatalli who elevated him and brought him into the royal family, Masturi did not remain loyal to Muwatalli's son, Urhi-Teshub, but defected to my father. He said to himself, why should I support a bastard? Why would I fight for the son of a concubine? Tudaliya then turned the accusation directly toward Shaushkamua. Will you act like Masturi? Someone causes trouble for me or for my descendants, and you, Shaushkamua, along with your wives, your sons, your foot soldiers, and your chariot troops, fail to give your full support and are not ready to die for us. Then this too will be bound by oath. You must protect me in my rule, and protect my descendants and theirs. Do not wish for any other ruler. If rebellion breaks out in Hatti, at this point the tablet is heavily damaged and a large section is missing. Tudaliya was focused on securing the future of his own dynasty. He wanted a firm promise from Shaushkamua that he would remain loyal only to Tudaliya and his descendants as rightful rulers of Hatti. To make his point clear, Tudaliya referenced recent turmoil within the Hittite royal family, highlighting the errors made by another vassal, Masturi. Masturi's situation had mirrored Shaushkamua's. Both had sworn loyalty to their Hittite overlords and had married Hittite princesses. However, when a dispute over the Hittite throne broke out, Masturi failed to honor his oath. He had pledged to protect Muwatalli's son, Urhi-Teshub. He instead sided with the usurper, Hattusili's own father, who ultimately seized power. Tudaliya pointed to Masturi's betrayal as a cautionary example, warning Shaushkamua not to make the same mistake. Ironically, though, Tudaliya condemned the disloyalty. He himself had benefited from it, as it secured the throne for his family. Still, he prioritized the importance of personal loyalty above all else. After addressing internal threats, Tutankhamun shifted focus to external dangers, namely Hattiti's rivals in the international arena. He clarified Shaushkamua's role in those broader conflicts. When the king of Egypt is my ally, he will also be your ally. But if he becomes my enemy, he must be your enemy as well. The kings who are my equals in rank are the rulers of Egypt, Babylonia, Assyria, and Ahiawa. When the king of Babylonia is friendly to me, you will treat him as a friend too. If he turns against me, you will consider him an enemy. The king of Assyria is already my enemy. Therefore, he must also be your enemy. You must not allow his merchants to enter your territory, nor should your merchants travel to his land. If any Assyrian merchant tries to pass through your country, you must arrest him and send him directly to me. This is part of the oath you must swear. Since I am at war with the king of Assyria, you are also required to raise an army and a chariot unit just as I have. What is urgent for me must be treated as equally urgent for you. No ships from Ahiawa are to travel to the Assyrian king. The rule of diplomacy that Tutankhamun imposed on Shaushkamua was straightforward. Whoever is an enemy of Hatti is your enemy, and whoever is a friend of Hatti is your friend. Because Hatti was at war with Assyria at the time, Amaru was required to halt all trade with that kingdom and capture any Assyrian merchants traveling through its territory. Tutankhamun only recognized as relevant the states whose rulers he saw as his equals, namely Egypt, Babylonia, and Assyria. Initially, the scribe had included Ahiawa in this group, likely referring to the Mycenaean world in the west, but later erased the name. This suggests that Ahiawa's position in international politics at the time was uncertain or contested. Version of the treaty translated here comes from one manuscript and is incomplete, as it does not list the gods meant to witness the agreement. The other, or damaged copy, does include the divine witnesses and ends with a stern warning. If you alter the words of this tablet, these gods will destroy you. To fully understand a treaty like the one between Tutankhamun and Shaushkamua, we need to view it in the context of its time. Such agreements only made sense when both parties recognized and accepted their roles within a broader political structure. The treaty itself helped to reinforce the hierarchical order that defined the Eastern Mediterranean world. Politically, that world was divided in two, a small group of powerful states, like Hatti, that dictated terms, and a larger number of lesser states, like Amaru, that were expected to comply. The rulers of the great powers, known as great kings, held the authority to issue commands. Those of lesser rank were considered subordinates, bound by treaty obligations to obey. In diplomatic letters, great kings addressed each other as brother, while lesser rulers had to call them master. A king's status largely depended on his military strength. Only those who could project power over others earned recognition as great kings. Even so, tradition also played a part. Some states retained great status due to long-standing precedent, and it often took time for diplomatic customs to reflect new political realities. These top-tier rulers formed an exclusive club of great powers. As with many elite circles, admission was difficult, often reserved more for legacy than actual capability. Still, change did happen. In 1230 BC, Tutankhamun listed the current great kings alongside himself, the rulers of Babylonia, Syria, and Egypt. His treaty even shows, through the erased mention of Ahiawa, that such status was never fully secure. A century earlier, during the time of the Amarna correspondence in the mid-14th century, the list of great powers was different. It included Egypt, Babylonia, Mitanni, Hatti, Elisha, and Arsawa in southwestern Anatolia. During that time, Syria aggressively pushed to join this exclusive group, much to the annoyance of the existing members. you with my senses as all my being why do I good I can why I do why I want we're angry we're rid of what wrote to an Egyptian pharaoh whose name he did not dare mention. His tone was nearly that of a great king. Later, he addressed Pharaoh Akhenaten as an equal and sent envoys to Egypt. This drew a harsh response from Bernaburish of Babylon, who wrote angrily to the pharaoh, "Those Assyrians are my vassals. I didn't send them. Why did they come? To your land on their own? If you value our relationship, don't let them conduct any business. Send them back empty-handed." Several decades later, Assurbanipal's successor, Adad-nirari I, who ruled from 1305 to 1274 BC, continued to face resistance from other rulers when he tried to claim the title of Great King, a Hittite king likely. Erhetasheb, although his name is missing from the record, responded angrily to Adad-nirari's overtures. "Why should I talk to you about brotherhood? Who keeps asking about brotherhood like this? Were we ever friends? Why should I treat you as a brother? Were you and I born of the same mother, just as my grandfather and father never addressed? The king of Assyria as a brother, you too should stop writing to me about brotherhood and great kingship." This emotional protest sounds like a refusal to accept the political reality of the time. By the point this letter was written, Syria had gained control over northeastern Syria and had become a serious military threat to Hatti. Its claim to great power status was no longer just ambition, it had been earned. The anxiety over who deserved the title of great king wasn't limited to the major powers themselves. Even lesser kings did not want to see their neighbors rise in rank. Around the same time Assyria was pushing for recognition, the king of Byblos Ribhadda complained to Egypt about the royal family of Amaru. Who are these sons of Abdi-Ashirta who have taken the king's land for themselves? Are they the king of Mitanni, the king of the Kassites, or the king of Hatti? This frustration reveals the political tensions caused by shifting power dynamics. Over time, the status of kingdoms could rise or fall dramatically. A dominant power faded into insignificance. Meanwhile, Assyria, which had once been a client state of Mitanni, rose to join the ranks of the great powers. Later, Elam may have also entered that elite circle as its armies roamed freely across Babylonia and Assyria with little resistance because historical records are incomplete. We cannot always trace these changes clearly. However, rulers of the time were keenly aware of who held what status at any given moment. This awareness was vital, as status determined not just how kings interacted with one another, but also what kind of behavior was considered appropriate. Although spread across vast regions, the kings of the Eastern Mediterranean acted as if they were part of one large extended family, similar to those found in traditional villages. There were elders who held authority, younger members eager to prove themselves, clearly defined roles of dominance and submission. Relationships were shaped by bloodlines and marriages, and important life events required mutual recognition. When Kadashman-Enlil of Babylon moved into a new palace, he invited fellow rulers, including Egypt's Amenhotep III, to join the celebration. It was unlikely the Egyptian king would attend, but the invitation still had to be made, just as one would feel obliged to invite a neighbor or a colleague in a small community. Just like in a family, feelings could be easily hurt, and arguments were common. When Kadashman-Enlil of Babylon invited Amenhotep III to a celebration, he took the opportunity to complain that he hadn't been invited to a recent Egyptian festival and hadn't received the traditional gifts that usually came with such invitations. In a similar vein, Etisili III of Hatti expressed frustration with the Assyrian king Adad-nirari for not acknowledging his rise to the throne. "When I became king, you didn't send a single envoy. It's customary for other kings' equals to send gifts, royal garments, and fine oil for anointing when a new king takes power. But you sent nothing." Though the kings behaved as if they were part of a close-knit community, like a giant village spread across empires, the idea was more symbolic than real. Face-to-face meetings between the great rulers were extremely rare. In fact, most of them never actually met. After the peace treaty between Egypt and Hatti, Ramesses II and Hattusili III discussed meeting in person, with Ramesses suggesting, "They come together in Canaan. I, the great king of Egypt, will come to the land of Canaan to meet my brother, the great king of Hatti. to see him face to face and welcome him to my land. There is no evidence that such a meeting ever took place. Lesser kings, however, didn't have the luxury of avoiding personal appearances. They were often summoned by their overlords and had to make long, sometimes dangerous journeys leaving. Others to govern in their absence. One such case was Aziru of Amaru, who traveled to Egypt to address concerns about his loyalty. His stay lasted so long, possibly more than a year, that rumors began to spread that he had been permanently detained. At one point, his son wrote a desperate letter to an Egyptian official. "The kings of Nuhash told me, 'You sold your father to the king of Egypt for gold. When will he be released?' And all the nearby peoples, including the Suteans, said, 'Aziru will never return from Egypt.' While the great kings occasionally met on the battlefield, even these encounters were rare. There's no record of dramatic one-on-one combat between rulers like the heroic duels described by Homer in the famous Battle of Kadesh. Both Ramesses II and Muwatalli led their armies in person. Ramesses portrayed the clash as a personal victory and accused Muwatalli of being too cowardly to face him directly. According to Ramesses' version, when the Hittites finally asked for peace, Muwatalli didn't come in person, but instead sent a letter through messengers. Peaceful communication between kings was essential. Keeping those channels open wasn't always easy due to the vast distances involved. All the major powers relied on messengers and ambassadors to exchange information. Some of these were professional envoys, well-known and trusted in foreign courts. For instance, Egypt and Mitanni appear to have used the same two messengers, Kalia and Main, for a long time in their diplomatic exchanges. Merchants also frequently acted as emissaries. These messengers typically carried royal letters written on cuneiform tablets. While many couldn't read the tablets themselves, they almost certainly delivered additional verbal messages to clarify or expand upon the written ones. Though they were usually treated with respect, messengers needed official permission to leave a foreign court and could sometimes be held as hostages. In one case, a Babylonian king complained that one of his envoys had been delayed in Egypt for 6 years. Travel itself was extremely slow. Overland messengers traveled by chariot or with mule caravans. A fast envoy might cover 30 to 35 kilometers a day, while slower travelers moved at half that pace. This meant that communication was delayed by weeks or months. A journey from the Egyptian capital Akhenaten to the Mitanni city of Washukani could take about a month, while trips to Hattusa or Babylon might take 6 weeks. Travel by sea was sometimes possible, but also slow and limited by the seasons. In ancient times, sailing was only safe during the warmer months. In the late Bronze Age, with less advanced ships than in later centuries, the sailing season was likely even shorter. Overland mountain passes, especially those leading into Anatolia, were often blocked by snow during winter, cutting off the Hittites from much of the region. Travel could also be dangerous. To protect messengers, kings issued formal travel documents requesting safe passage from other rulers whose lands they crossed. One such document survives in the Amarna letters. It reads, "To the kings of Canaan, servants of my brother, thus says the king of Mitanni, I have sent my messenger Achaia to the king of Egypt, my brother, in haste. Do not delay him. Ensure he reaches Egypt safely and hand him over to the commander at the fortress. Let him go immediately. Carries no gifts with him." However, many regions were beyond full state control, making travel hazardous due to the threat of nomads and bandits. Hattusili III of the Hittites, for instance, once speculated that his lack of communication from Babylon was due to the Alamu people disrupting travel routes. The seas could also be perilous. Although the events in the Egyptian story of Weneman took place after the collapse of the Eastern Mediterranean system, they highlight the risks travelers faced. In the story, a priestly envoy from the Temple of Ammon in Thebes endured multiple ordeals on his mission to Byblos in modern-day Lebanon. He was robbed at a port in Canaan, and on his return, his ship drifted off course and landed in Cyprus, where locals attacked him and threatened his life. Despite such dangers, international relations remained a frequent and essential part of life in the late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean. We know a great deal about them thanks to surviving collections of letters. Every royal court employed scribes who handled diplomatic correspondence between their rulers and both peers and subordinate leaders. These letters were usually written in Babylonian, the common diplomatic language of the time, inscribed in cuneiform on clay tablets. A few of these diplomatic archives have been preserved. The most significant is the Amarna archive, discovered at the site of Akhenaten, a short-lived capital founded by the Egyptian king Akhenaten. This collection includes letters from the final years of Amenhotep III and throughout Akhenaten's reign. The most recent letters may date from the early reign of Tutankhamun, just before the city was abandoned. Some letters were likely brought to the city at its founding, and others may have been taken away when the administration relocated. What was left behind were mostly documents considered disposable. In general, ancient chancelleries didn't keep letters for long, often discarding them after a few years once they were no longer considered useful. The Amarna archive covers a maximum span of about 30 years, from around 1360 to 1330 BCE, though possibly less, maybe only 15 years. It contains about 40 letters exchanged between the pharaoh and other great rulers, as well as over 300 letters between the Egyptian king or his officials and vassals in Syrio-Palestine. Only 4 letters in the entire archive were not written in Babylonian. 1 was in Assyrian, 1 in Hurrian, and 2 were in Hittite. The archives found in the Hittite, capital of Hattusa, show that diplomatic correspondence remained active throughout the Late Bronze Age to date. Around 120 letters to and from the Hittite court have been identified, though many are fragmentary. These letters span from the late 14th to the late 13th century BCE, with most coming from the reigns of Hattusili III and Tudaliya IV. Between 1267 and 1209 BCE, the most complete group of letters includes a dozen exchanges between the royal courts of Hattusili III and the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II. Other correspondence involves rulers and officials from Assyria, Babylonia, Alatia, and various Hittite client states. Though these are fewer in number, the archives at Akhenaten and Hattusa belong to major powers. But it's clear that similar archives must have existed at other great courts throughout the region and period. At Durkirgal-Su, for instance, a single letter was found from a Hittite king to the queen of Babylonia, suggesting more documents are waiting to be discovered. Lesser kings also needed to maintain communication with their peers and overlords. Excavations at Syro-Palestinian cities like Kumaду and Gezer have revealed that they had trained scribes for diplomatic work. Although only a small number of tablets have been recovered so far, the one exception is Ugarit, a port city where archaeologists found a large number of letters around 350 in total, mainly in the royal palace and nearby administrative buildings. So far, about 200 have been published. These letters document correspondence between Ugarites, kings, queens, and top officials in foreign powers such as Alatia, Syria, and Egypt. Most of them concern dealings with the Hittite king, either directly in Hattusa or via the Hittite viceroy based in Carchemish. Although a few older letters were preserved, the majority date from the last 4 decades of Ugarit's existence. While letters between kings helped maintain relationships, they were not legally binding. For more formal agreements, rulers created treaties. Only a few of these survive, and nearly all come from Hattusa. The exceptions are 2 early treaties from Alalik and 1 Egyptian treaty from the reign of Ramesses II that involved the Hittites. Still, many other treaties must have existed, as they are mentioned in other sources. These treaties were always between 2 rulers rather than between states, and had to be renewed every time a new king took the throne. For example, a full series of treaties has survived showing the evolving relationship between Hatti and Amaro, including agreements between Suppiluliuma and Aziro, Mersili II and Tupateshep, Tezili III and Bentashina, and Tudaliya IV and Shashkamua. The tone and structure of treaties varied depending on the relationship. Treaties between equals had matching clauses for both sides. In contrast, treaties between a powerful ruler and a subordinate focused almost entirely on the obligations of the lesser partner. Letters and treaties offer the clearest picture of peaceful international relations. Often support this, especially when foreign goods turn up far from their place of origin. For instance, Babylonian cylinder seals found in the Greek city of Thebes may suggest diplomatic contact. However, there are other possible explanations. The objects could have arrived through trade, as tribute from subjugated peoples or as loot from military campaigns. Indeed, not all contact between states was peaceful. Warfare was a regular feature of the Late Bronze Age and a major part of how states interacted with one another. Whether peaceful or hostile, the nature of any relationship was shaped by the relative status of the two powers involved. In the following sections, I'll look more closely at these interactions, first between equals, then between dominant states and their subjects. Asterisk, asterisk, the great powers of the Eastern Mediterranean earned their elite status by being able to dominate others. They were the masters, and the smaller states under their control often expressed complete submission, at least in writing. Letters addressed to these great kings would typically open with dramatic declarations of loyalty, such as message from Abdiash Hirta, your servant, the dust beneath your feet. I bow before the king, my lord, 7 and 7 times. Look, I am the king's servant and the dog of his household. I guard all of Amaru for the king, my lord. This kind of subordination was relatively new in the region. While powerful kingdoms had previously exerted control over others, the kind of widespread systematic dominance seen in the Late Bronze Age had not existed before. In particular, the small kingdoms of Syrio-Palestine caught between major powers, like Egypt, Mitanni, Hatti, and Elasio, were often forced to submit to whichever great state held the upper hand. But even beyond that region, other areas also fell under foreign rule. Egypt annexed Nubia. The Hittites sometimes controlled parts of western Anatolia. Syria absorbed the remains of Mitanni after it collapsed, and Babylonia even ruled far off. Places like the island of Bahrain. There were likely other examples that haven't yet been uncovered. These expansions came through military campaigns, and we have detailed accounts of how the great states subdued their neighbors. While a full history of those events isn't the focus here, it's important to note that military power was a key diplomatic tool. The great kings could always threaten war to get their way, while the smaller states lacked the resources to mount any serious resistance. That didn't stop them from trying, though some kings of minor states put up fierce opposition. Thutmose III, for instance, recounted a hard-fought battle against Syrian forces near Megiddo, which showed both his military prowess and the determination of his enemies. The frequent attempts by small states to free themselves from foreign domination suggest that being under the control of a great power was far from pleasant. Despite their military dominance, the great states often showed flexibility in how they governed their subject territories. Scholars studying empires have proposed models to explain the variety of relationships between rulers and the ruled. One useful model describes a spectrum between two types of control, territorial and hegemonic. In territorial control, conquered regions were directly annexed and ruled as provinces. In hegemonic control, local rulers stayed in power, but became subordinates, or client kings. Many real-world situations fell somewhere in between these two extremes. In the Late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean, every point on this spectrum could be found, and the dominant powers adapted their approach as circumstances required. Egypt provides the clearest picture of how a powerful state managed its conquered lands. It also shows how flexible such a system could be, adjusting to local conditions and changing political realities. At no point in Egypt's ancient history was its empire larger than during the years between 1500 and 1150 BCE. Continuous military campaigns by the early pharaohs of the 18th dynasty extended Egyptian influence, dramatically stretching about 1,000 kilometers south beyond the traditional southern border at the First Cataract, and some 900 kilometers north into Asia. Although Egypt eventually lost some of this territory, especially in the north, it remained the most expansive and far-reaching power of the time. Its rule over these regions showed both direct control and indirect, more hands-off influence. In Nubia, Egypt took a hands-on approach. When Egyptian armies conquered the region, they destroyed the only existing local power, the Kingdom of Kerma, which had reached its peak just before Egypt's rise. With no native government left to work through, the Egyptians had to create their own administration from scratch. They formally annexed the land up to at least the Third Cataract and divided it into two key regions: Watay, between the First and Second Cataracts, and Kush, between the Second and Fourth Cataracts. These areas were governed directly by a royal official acting in the name of the pharaoh. This viceroy, although not of royal blood, was usually a trusted figure from the Egyptian civil service or military. Over time, his position came to include parts of southern Upper Egypt as well, and he was eventually given the prestigious title King's Son of Kush. Egypt's system of rule in Nubia closely mirrored its structure at home. Each of the two main regions had its own deputy governor. It's just like Upper and Lower Egypt. The Egyptian administration built new towns centered around temples. It's modeled after similar cities in Egypt itself. Fortresses were also constructed across Lower Nubia. To assert Egyptian presence, these settlements were clearly separated from the surrounding local areas and were populated mainly by Egyptians. While these officials managed state affairs, they did depend on local Nubians, whom they trained in Egyptian customs and ways of life. There was no real effort to respect or preserve local culture, and archaeological evidence shows a steady shift from native Nubian traditions to Egyptian practices, especially in burial customs. Farther south, beyond the Third Cataract, Egyptian control was more limited. Only a handful of fortified towns were established, mostly in strategic locations. Instead of direct rule, the Egyptians allowed local leaders to remain in power, but made them answer to the Egyptian authorities, specifically to officials known as overseers of the southern lands. To maintain influence over these local elites, Egypt brought the sons of powerful Nubian families to Egypt. There, they were given an Egyptian education and eventually sent back to rule. It's now loyal to Egyptian interests. Part of Egypt's motivation for occupying Nubia was economic. Through local middlemen, Egypt obtained luxury goods like incense, panther skins, ivory, ebony, and slaves from deeper in Africa. The mountainous region east of the Nile was also rich in gold, which Egypt mined extensively. Control over the Nile Valley gave Egypt safe transportation routes, and its settlements there supported farming. In Upper Nubia, Egyptian efforts seem to have expanded arable land and encouraged cattle grazing. Egyptians didn't just extract raw materials, they also developed local manufacturing, aimed at a market shaped by Egyptian tastes. Nubian artisans shifted to making goods in Egyptian styles. Some historians have compared this system to a plantation economy, where local labor served only the needs of distant rulers. That might be a bit of an exaggeration, but it's clear that the Egyptians largely saw Nubians as inferior people, useful only for their resources and labor. In contrast, Egypt approached Syrio-Palestine very differently, especially as control over the region was contested by other major powers. Unlike in Nubia, Egypt did not dismantle the existing political structures in Syrio-Palestine. The region had long been home to independent city-states ruled by local kings, and Egypt chose to work with them rather than replace them. This led to a system of indirect or hegemonic control. This approach is well documented in the Amarna letters. The Egyptian grip was strongest in a narrow coastal strip about 50 kilometers wide, but their influence reached further inland. Local rulers, referred to by Egypt as mayors, were under the authority of the pharaoh and had to pay yearly taxes, which were collected by Egyptian officials. Egypt maintained three main administrative centers in the region: Gaza on the southern coast, Coumeday in inland Lebanon, and Sumer on the northern coast. Military presence was minimal. For example, only 10 soldiers were stationed in Jerusalem. To keep it under control, the local kings handled most of their own governance and often fought with each other more than they resisted Egyptian rule. In the northern regions, Egyptian authority was especially shaky. Known as noted earlier, Aziru, the ruler of Amaru, negotiated with the Hittites and pressured neighboring kings to shift allegiance to. The king of Byblus complained repeatedly to Egypt about Amru's aggression, but Egypt didn't intervene militarily to help him. The Egyptians relied on local elites in Syria-Palestine to collect taxes and deliver goods. But they did not try to force these people to adopt Egyptian customs. In fact, Egypt adapted to local norms. It used the Babylonian language written in cuneiform on clay tablets for official communication. And it even incorporated some Syrian gods and cultural practices into Egyptian life. Publicly Egyptian. Art continued to portray both Syrians and Nubians as foreign enemies, distinguished mainly by their appearance. But behind these stereotypes, Egyptians treated Syrian culture with far more respect than they showed toward Nubians. Around 1350 BCE, Egypt controlled its foreign territories in two different ways. In the south, Egypt had annexed much of Nubia and ruled it directly. In the north, it maintained control through local rulers who acted as client kings. The political situation in Syrio-Palestine was far more unstable than in Nubia, so Egypt had to be more flexible there. Up until about 1350, Egypt had been the dominant power in the region. But the rise of the Hittites under Suppiluliuma I, who ruled from 1350 to 1322, challenged Egypt's supremacy. As mentioned earlier, kingdoms like Amaru began aligning themselves. With Hatti and Egypt's influence started to fade. The kings of Egypt's 19th dynasty, especially Seti, the first 1290 to 1279 BCE, and Ramesses II, 1279 to 1213 BCE, managed to reassert Egypt's military strength. However, they could not fully reclaim dominance over northern Syria. As a result, Egypt adjusted its approach to the south. Instead of working through local rulers, Egypt began to administer the region directly. Egyptian officials were placed in command, living in specially built residences and military outposts. They even imported goods from Egypt to maintain their lifestyle abroad. At the same time, the local population began to adopt Egyptian customs and practices. Southern Syria and Palestine became more like annexed territory, though not as thoroughly integrated as Nubia had been. Syrio-Palestine was an important source of wealth for Egypt. The Sinai Desert contained valuable mineral resources, especially copper. The Lebanon mountains provided high-quality timber, a resource Egypt lacked. Syrian agricultural goods like wine were also highly prized, and the region's artisans were famous for producing luxury items such as purple-dyed textiles, fine metalwork, and ornate furniture. The other great powers of the Late Bronze Age were just as flexible as Egypt in how they handled conquered territories. Though we have far less evidence about their policies, like Egypt, these powers generally tried to keep their expenses low, which usually meant keeping local governments intact while overseeing them through alliances with client rulers. This arrangement minimized administrative costs while still maintaining control. In the case of the Mitannians and the Mycenaeans, whose political systems we know relatively little about, they may have ruled entirely through such local clients, Hatti, from which we have the most surviving treaties, typically tied subordinate rulers to the Hittite king through binding agreements. However, in key locations, the Hittites installed members of their own royal family. King Suppiluliuma, for example, placed his sons on the thrones of Karkemish, controlling a major Euphrates crossing and Aleppo. It's an important hub on the east-west trade route. Over time, these princes established their own dynasties, blurring the lines between being royal officials and client kings. Assyria, which expanded later than the others, made a clearer distinction between core and peripheral territories. Lands near the Assyrian heartland were annexed and ruled directly by Assyrian officials who lived in specially built towns. These areas became fully Assyrian in status, and by the late 12th century BCE, they were officially called the Land of Assur. In contrast, territories farther away remained under the control of local client kings and were considered to be under the yoke of Assur. In the core provinces, Assyria maintained control through strategically placed settlements, often redesigning old towns in the Assyrian style. The relationship between client kings and their overlords often resembled that of younger family members to the head of a household. Personal bonds were extremely important, and diplomatic marriages were a key way to reinforce those connections. Many princesses from client states became lesser wives in the courts of great kings. Egyptian pharaohs in particular amassed large numbers of foreign brides, so many that some historians have suggested they were practicing hypergamy, marrying up by bringing foreign nobility into their harem. Thutmose III, for example, listed princesses among the tribute he received in Syria. These women not only enhanced the king's image and prestige, but also served a strategic purpose. They were hostages. If a client ruler rebelled, he had to worry about what might happen to his daughter or sister at the Egyptian court. The Hittites, however, stand out in this regard. As mentioned in the treaty at the beginning of the chapter, the Hittite kings often did the reverse. They married their own sisters and daughters off to client kings. This was highly unusual. What Kalulioma gave away 2 daughters and a sister? 2 lesser rulers. In Tudalia's treaty, he refers to Muwaddali's sister marrying Mastori, minor king in the Seha River region, and says that his own sister was married to Shaushkamua of Amaru. This is the only documented case of such a practice by a great king, and it marks a significant departure from the norm. These marriages potentially put Hittite royal women in dangerous situations, though we hear nothing about what happened to Masteri's wife when he rebelled. This unusual policy suggests that the Hittites placed special value on building personal relationships with their clients. Another method the great powers used to secure loyalty from their dependent territories was by educating the sons of local rulers at their own royal courts. These young princes were raised with the ideals and worldview of their overlords. After their training, they were sent back to govern their native lands, now loyal to the great kings and often disconnected from their own people and traditions. One striking example of this process is the Nubian prince Hekenefer, who ruled Bayam near the Second Cataract of the Nile. He took an Egyptian name and was buried in a fully Egyptian style. Inscriptions in his tomb call him a servant of Pharaoh and a child of the nursery, a term used for those raised at the Egyptian royal court. Yet, despite his Egyptianized life, Egyptians still saw him as Nubian. Of Nubia, Hekenefer appears dressed in traditional Nubian clothing, with skin color that clearly identifies him as Nubian. The expansion of territory by the great powers served multiple purposes. It was partly defensive. Conquered areas created buffer zones between the great states and potential enemies. This was especially important in Syrio-Palestine, which lay between powerful rivals. Conflicts between Egypt and Mitanni, or between Egypt and Hatti, rarely reached their core territories instead. They fought over their borderlands. Similarly, frontier regions across the eastern Mediterranean were home to many unpredictable and hostile groups. And it was far more practical to let client kings handle them than face direct attacks. There were also strong economic motives behind expansion. While the initial conquest brought in huge amounts of plunder which rulers proudly displayed in inscriptions and art, this was a one-time gain. The true goal was to create a steady and reliable income. Often the great powers restructured the local economies to serve their own needs. Agriculture was a key concern. The Hittites and Assyrians saw northern Syria as a vital source of grain. While Egypt expanded farming in Upper Nubia, many territories offered valuable natural resources, such as minerals, forests, or access to important trade routes. Egypt gained gold from Nubia and fine timber from the forests of Lebanon. The Hittites and Assyrians found mineral wealth in eastern Anatolia. By extending their reach to the Persian Gulf, the Babylonians tapped into overseas trade, while Egypt imported exotic goods from sub-Saharan and East Africa via its Nubian territories. Manufactured items were in high demand as well. Syrio-Palestine, in particular, was famous for its luxury crafts, including fine textiles, metalwork, and carved furniture. These goods, whether raw materials or finished products, were sent regularly to the great courts as tribute or custom commissions. There's little indication that the great powers hesitated to extract as much as they could. Their courts depended on these resources for wealth, power, and prestige. While some modern scholars highlight the investments that the great powers made in their conquered territories, these efforts clearly served the occupiers' interests far more than those of the local populations.